Sheefra Blume. I'm
Hi, my
so
dear.
I'm so excited to have you. Also, I love your last name's Bloom. What an amazing, powerful name to have. Wow. Aren't we all like forever blooming? Thank
Thank
you
you.
for being on this podcast and
It's an
for
honor.
it's like so many things that we're going to talk about. I can't even wait because I just know how it's just going to go and it's just going to go. So I want to start though by the thing behind you, because just briefly mentioning your history and this, if you're listening, we're on a video, you can watch this on YouTube if you want to see, but this is a really beautiful tapestry that Sheefra has behind her. And those birds, like, I just feel like that is so important. And what is so cool is that Sheefra, I am kind of making my way to warm weather. As I told you, I'm in a van. And as you know, you saw the van when we met, but I froze. It was too cold and my heat also stopped working. So I got to get that all fixed. So I got this Airbnb, and you will never believe the street name. Are you ready?
I'm ready.
It's a Weaver.
Weaver. Oh, cool.
I know.
Yeah.
I know. Okay, so tell me or tell us the story of this tapestry, including your history, what you studied, your thesis. Let's just jump in there.
Yeah. Okay, cool. I'm so stoked to be here. I'm so excited for where our conversation's going to go because I know it's going to be awesome. This tapestry, it's so interesting because this tapestry takes me way back in time. I bought it when I was 19 years old in Ayacucho, Peru. And it takes me way back to this time period that was so influential to me and has so much to do with everything I already think we're going to talk about today. And I didn't expect to talk about this tapestry, and yet here it is behind me and it's so relevant. So I'll tell the story of this tapestry. Well, when I was in college, I was at the University of Colorado studying English creative writing and Spanish literature. And Spanish literature has a lot to do with, well, I was studying a lot of magical realism. That was what I was really drawn to. And magical realism, for those of you that aren't familiar, the way I understand it is, what I learned from it is one person's reality is another person's complete fantasy. And what is 100% true to one person, their perspective, might seem completely fantastical to another person. And so it's interesting to be thinking about it in this way, where that's the literature that when you read it, it feels magical, it feels fantastical, and yet realizing how much that influenced the story alchemy work that I do, which is about just that. So rewinding, I'm 19 years old and I went down to Ayacucho, Peru with a girlfriend of mine, and I volunteered in this orphanage, and it completely changed my life forever and really deeply influenced me. And then I went back when I was 21 on a grant from my university to do research for my final thesis. And while I was down there, I met, his name is Faustino Flores, and he is really pretty influential in that department of Peru, but he is a master tapestry weaver. And so I met him and his wife, and they took me to their home and they showed me their studio with just, I think, like 9 huge looms set up and the beautifully colored natural dyeing yarns on the roof of their home. And they told me the stories of their tapestries, and I got to be in their studio and their home. And this one was done by his teacher. So Edwin Sulca is his maestro and his teacher. And Edwin Sulca adopted Faustino when Faustino was a boy, because that was around when the Sendero Luminoso communist rebel group was really active in that part of Peru. And so, you know, this whole story of how Faustino had to flee his home, and then he took up with his maestro and learned the art of tapestry weaving. So that's a little bit of the history of that. And the tapestry itself, what I love is it's this 3D kind of magical, mysterious thing. And the thing about the weaver, the weaving, the loom, is in magical realism in Spanish literature, you have this theme of tapestry and like also the funeral shroud that someone will, I think it's in 100 Years of Solitude, especially, where there's like a beautiful scene and the woman's weaving her shroud that she's going to be buried in. And she can't die until it's finished, you know, and it's like, but she's weaving one more weave through the loom, one more weave through the loom, and it changes. And so it just reminds me of life, and it changes the story of the tapestry. And, you know, there's this element of like, it could just pop out of the story and become real. And so true is that with the story alchemy of our own life, that even this conversation is the threading of one more weave in our loom. And this conversation will inevitably, though we don't know how, change the design of the tapestry that is our life. And probably many people who will get to listen to this conversation as well. So that's the story of this tapestry.
Wow.
Of weaving, of looming, of story work, and yeah.
Well, and even weaving as, you know, it's ancient art form, you know, thinking of how women would go into trance and just completely be consumed by it and let themselves come through it. And I love hearing stories of that, whether it's basket weaving or even what you just said. I didn't even know that, but what a beautiful visual of like recognizing that we all return to earth and knowing what we return into and creating that and what holds us, and how everything is just like intention. It is such intention, which is such a big part of the work that you do and what you're bringing into the world.
Well, I just realized another connection as you're speaking. This is so cool, which is that the word tantra means to weave, or, you know, to
Wow.
loom, like to weave together, right? And so usually when we think of tantra in the West, we're thinking of like masculine and feminine, you know, weaving together, becoming one. And yet it goes beyond that. And I, you know, in the four worlds work that I do, and even just the story alchemy, it's weaving, it's looming together, it's looming perspectives together. But I speak about, you know, Kabbalah and the four worlds as a tantric system, not in the Hindu or Buddhist sense, but in the root of what to weave and to loom and to, you know, even yoga, yoke together. So all of these things are even more related than I realized.
Oh my God, this is going to be so magic. Well, and this is part of it too. Like when we first met, which was recent, it was just, I have to understand more about this in a way that makes it. I talk about creation so often, like creative. We are creative beings. We must create without expectation and with hopefully some long-term foresight or farsightedness to repercussions of what we create. And yet I am so clueless when it comes to the origin of creation and some of these ancient wisdoms and teachings. And so when we met and you did that first reading, it felt as if the words you were saying, like the deepest parts of my soul were starting to wake up, you know, this really intense remembering. And so I would love to hear, I guess maybe even the word Kabbalah that you mentioned, you have taught me it means to receive. And that's even that. I'm like, oh my gosh, there's so much I have yet to know. So could you maybe give me like the very basic intro to Kabbalah and really this, you know, kind of remembering of receiving and the origin of creation?
Okay.
Here we go.
Story time. So like you said, Kabbalah technically translates to mean to receive. And it's interesting because people will often be like, oh, have you read the Kabbalah? And it's not a book. There's no book that's called the Kabbalah. You know, it's not like, have you read the Bible or something? There are works, and there are works that are specifically the primary go-to works. And there's many books written on Kabbalah, and if you think about that word, to receive, And part of why Kabbalah is so magical is that it's up here. It's around us. It's that which we receive. It's the knowing. And then it's the teachings on how to access the knowing. It is what it is a tradition of mysticism, for those who don't know. It's a tradition of mysticism that explains the who we are and why we're here and how we got here and where we're going and what we're doing here and how, what to do about it, right? And like in the receiving are all of those answers. And yes, Kabbalah is a specific tradition that has its own specific frameworks. And we could distill it down that simply to when you clear yourself enough and get into that place of true receiving, and there's a lot of things that cloud our receiving, then that's Kabbalah. And that all the teachings of the framework of Kabbalah are eventually getting us there to be able to really be in the receiving of what? Of the divine, of God, of breath, which there's a whole thing we can talk about the breath and God if we want to get there, of life and of a meaningful life and of a life where you truly get to serve out the potential for which you were born. So that would be my intro of like, well, what is Kabbalah? I can share the narrative of creation if you want. Is that what you wanted me to share?
Whatever you're sharing, I'm into. I mean, even your intro to what you are putting out into the world, you know, this deck, this book, this product. I mean, the way you say it, it's the introduction to Kabbalah for the purpose-driven soul, which is so beautiful, which is like, you know, we're all fighting for purpose in so many ways. And you said so many things cloud our ability to receive, right? This is it. This is it. Why we struggle so much with receiving. I would love to sit in that for a second, if there's anything that really common themes, because I feel if we could be of service to anyone listening, it's to receive better, to receive in a way that allows us to tap into bliss, because that's what we're supposed to feel. Yet we are so disconnected from remembering we deserve that sometimes. And we go through waves, and there's times where it's easier to receive than others. And there's definitely the reciprocity of give and take. But I would, if we could sit, especially in wintertime, knowing that we need to receive now more than ever, what comes up most often, and do you feel in your own personal journey or those you work with, of the cloud of receiving? What clouds are receipt?
Receptivity. I'll answer it in two different ways. The first way I'll answer is what I see through my work and through my experience. And then from there, what's really cool is that we can take that and put it into a framework that we get from Kabbalah, and specifically from the four worlds, which is the piece of this entire mysticism of Kabbalah that I focus on, and that my book is about, and that my deck is about, and that my business is called. It's the four worlds, right? And so I can briefly also talk about that framework, because it actually gives us, and specifically the way that I articulate it specifically gives us a map. It's so cool. It's so cool. So what I see that blocks our receptivity to, and it's like receptivity to what? Well, again, just to reiterate what we're talking about, is like our receptivity to our knowing and to our connection with our higher self, to that bliss that comes from knowing yourself and from knowing your connection to the divine, right? That's what I'm talking about. To those hits of guidance that lead us deeper and deeper into serving in our purpose. And the thing that I find often is, well, let me back up. So I'll give a little introduction to the four worlds with this, because the way, according to the four worlds tradition, and that's, you know, coming from Kabbalah, the way that anything comes into form, anything gets created, is through the steps of the four worlds, 1, 2, 3, 4. And these are 4 stages. So the idea is, if anything comes in through the four worlds, that would be creation itself, or you and I as an incarnated being, or a business that we want to put out in the world, or a piece of art that we want to create in the world, or any kind of idea like that, and an illness that has manifested. And so where I hone in on is, okay, well, if a challenge or an obstacle or an illness is manifested through these 4 stages, then I now have a map for how to also heal it. And so I'm going to give you a long-winded answer here, if that's okay, but we're going to circle back around.
Please.
So in those 4 stages, why don't I go ahead and list out what they are just so people can hear it. In Hebrew, it's Atzilut, Beriah, Yetzirah, and Asiya.
Can I repeat those? I feel like I need to say this. Okay. Atzila,
Atzilut,
Atzilut,
Beriah,
Birhia,
Yetzirah,
Yetzira,
Asiya.
Asiya.
Yeah.
Mm.
And in English, the direct translation would be the world of emanation, the world of creation, the world of formation, and the world of action. Okay. So then from there, to just give like a one-liner for each of those, the world of emanation is the world of belief and dreams and ideas. And it's the world where you're like, oh, I just got an idea. It's on the tip of my tongue. I can't quite articulate it yet. Okay. And then we go into the world of Beriah, which is the world of creation, which is the world of thought. The idea is now formed into a thought, and we can go, oh, what if we did it like this? What if we did it like this? We're throwing paint at the wall. We're experimenting. We're thinking about it. We're chewing on it. And then we come down into the world of formation, which is where we give structure and form to it. And it's also the world of speech. We can now articulate it. It's also the world of emotion. We can feel into it. And that's the world of formation. And then finally, we come down into the world of action, which is the embodied, living, breathing experience of it all.
Wow. Do you feel and maybe if we just dividing in those 4, my first thought is that so many of us feel like we are stuck in belief or stuck in thought when maybe it's just not time for creation, or maybe it is, right, this like urgency, the lack of patience I think so many of us have to put something into the form or action without full respect to emanation and creation, right?
Yeah. And just to remind us where we're going, we're answering the question of what most commonly blocks us, right? So we're just going to keep going down this storytelling and keep coming back to that question until we've answered it.
Wow.
And
yeah.
you're pointing us back to the answer to that question, which is where we're going here, which is the belief and the thoughts, the story that we're living in. So yeah, absolutely. It's like we rush forward to step 3 and 4 before gestation. And what happens if a baby's born premature? It's not fully developed. It may or may not make it, right? So we let incubate, we let gestate, we give the nourishment necessary so that when the project comes into form, when whatever it is comes into form, it can come in, fully developed. That's the ideal goal, right? And can you go in not fully developed? Yeah, it just takes a lot more support and work and risk of burnout, etc. Right?
Right.
So within the 4 stages are 11, there's many actually, but there's 11 major steps. And actually there's 121 because within each one there's this 11 over again, and it's actually infinite. It's a hologram, but we'll just stick with the 11. Okay.
11.
Yeah, we'll stick with the 11. And some people say 12 or 13 or 10 or 7, and it's because there's more, there's a different amount. And this teaching is through the 11, and usually it's 10. There's a secret one, and I include it. It's secret because it's the most powerful and not usually taught. And in those 11 stages, so here's the thing is, when we can identify a block, for example, and it was a block to us, to our receptivity, but I think the idea is like really to overcoming whatever the obstacle is, to stepping into our purpose, to healing the ailment, to whatever that is, right? The block, if we can root kind of like at which level that is, at which stage, which world, and then the map goes even more specific because we can see which of those 11, their energy centers, their attributes of our personality, if you will. If we could see which of those is underdeveloped or challenged, there's light and shadow sides to each of those. So, you know, we can get various, and that's what my card deck does, right? Is like you get that reflection, and then you get prompts, and then you go through the story alchemizing process so that you can heal it. And so ultimately, what I found though, it's like this process I love, because I love having a process to follow. It's like, oh, I know what to do. And if something is, say, at the physical level in the world of Asiya, then you might do a more physical modality, right? And so in my personal story, I'd love to share how I realized that most blocks are rooted in the world of belief. That's what I found.
Wow. Yeah.
And I found that through my own, when I was practicing clinical herbalism, my clinical practice, and then, you know, coaching hundreds of people for over the last however many years. I've found that also in my own personal experience in my story. And I'll share that if that's, yeah. So in my story,
Please.
I used to have really severe chronic eczema, which is like itchy skin. And I had it growing up, and then it got worse and worse through college. And it was like so painful that it felt like it felt like I was burning. It was so uncomfortable. And it got to the point where it was just all over my body. It was on my chest, it was on my eyes, it was all over. And at some point I realized that allopathic medicine, which is Western medicine, didn't have an answer for me, because I'd been to all of the dermatologists, and finally there didn't have an answer. And that's where you go, oh, well, it's just some chronic, and then they give it a name that's like, it's called itis, which just means wherever the problem is inflamed. And you're like, cool, that's not helpful.
Something itis. Yes, that's
Yeah, you're like
exactly it.
eczema.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
And so that's when I, you know, started looking into herbal medicine and energy medicine and yoga and nutrition. And so, you know, a lot of people will heal things like eczema through an elimination diet. Well, it turns out that I don't have a wheat or dairy sensitivity, which are the most common. There's all kinds of sensitivities one can have. But for me, after all that, it's like it wasn't a food sensitivity. And so then I learned about, okay, well, eczema is, you know, the skin is the largest organ. So I want to look at my detoxification pathways. I want to cleanse the blood. Therefore, I want to address the lungs and the lymph and the liver. And so I support this more on the herbal, address it from like an herbal medicine aspect. And, you know, I want to make sure I'm getting enough sleep and enough exercise. So even back in the father of medicine, Hippocrates told us, like, when we're addressing something, it's 4 stages. We go lifestyle, you know, just basics, like, are you walking every day? Are you moving? Are you sleeping? To food, to medicine, meaning herbal medicine, and then finally to emergency medicine, meaning surgery, or now allopathic medicine. And so I tried everything and all the modalities and acupuncture and like therapy and everything. Well, therapy is helpful, but depending which kind of therapy, it can still be kind of surface. And so what it ended up being is like, oh, there's so much stuck emotion. And so I had to release that emotion. And then what I really had to do was change the story that I was living in about who I was. But I couldn't even change the story until I first changed my emotion. and then the way I thought about it, and then change the belief. So you say I'm going up the ladder, right? And I like to think of our beliefs. The beliefs are the house that we're living in. And the walls of the house are made up with the specific stories that we tell about our life. And usually it's things we're not even conscious about. It's things that we tend to take for granted as true. And then the walls themselves, like the bricks of the wall, are made up of the actual sentences and the actual words that we're using that influence us. Like the definition of the word spell is a word or combination of words of great influence. So that is my long-winded answer to what blocks us.
No, that's beautiful. And then just brought me back to the first day we met, because it was the power of language and speech and belief that you were a part of. Would there be anything tied into that that would be important to share of repatterning, and kind of also with the group that you work with, of how that ties into the things we say, the way we say them? Words are no longer just words. You're invoking something, right? They're so powerful. And I wrote about this the other day. It's very Jupiter and Pisces kind of vibe, like, and I love this visual that's just in my head. So I'm still trying to figure out how to say it, but how important it is for us to, one, share our story, right? When we can express our story and share our story, whether it's a story of illness or a story of healing, there's so much that can be moved, right? Because we think things through. It's no longer a think thing. This is a getting something out of your system thing, right? A yell, an anger, a punch to something that's not somebody, right? There's expression of self, and sometimes speaking that story, but then so too often does that story get shared again and again and again, and it ends up trapping us, right? So what becomes our therapy all of a sudden is our prison. I would love any thoughts about the language, the speak, the group that you work with, anything that comes from, the power of words.
Language, speech. Yeah. So I have a lot of things to say about this topic, and just sometimes I take notes so that I remember what I want to talk about. So the question is the way that our words and language influence us, really.
And also, I'm thinking of how and also how we first did the card pull, right? So you pulled the cards for me, and then you sat with me in one of these cards that you had pulled, and there was a change of language that kind of patterned and helped kind of reinforce, right? So that piece of like, okay, there is, of course, the stories of the past that trap us,
right?
Even if they can be therapy once or twice or a couple times. And now this pattern of rewiring, how to move into that.
Yeah. So I was speaking to a woman just a couple of nights ago, and, we're talking about, she had this belief that she hardly even noticed was a belief, because it was so deeply there, that essentially that she was undesirable, or that she was, too old or not good enough, all of these things. And it was so obvious to me because it was coming out in her language. And to me, I didn't take for granted that those things were true, but I saw how she was creating that experience by reinforcing it. And so one thing, and I told this to her, is I remember even in my own life, when there's like a lineage where these are called automatic negative thoughts, and I forget who coined that term, but automatic negative thoughts, it's like a therapeutic term, and those can plague us sometimes. And even if it's not seemingly negative, these stories that are just automatic stories that are influencing us, that may not really be serving us, these automatic negative stories or negative thoughts, what do we do about that, right? And so the first thing that I was sharing with her was, once you learn the tools to change them, is to know that it actually works. Because when you actually apply the correct tools, you actually do create new neural pathways in your brain. And I know this to be true, not only from working with clients, but from my own self, because there was a time in my life when those automatic negative thoughts were so strong. I thought, I mean, it was unfathomable to think about a time when that might not be the experience I was having constantly. And now that's not the experience I have almost ever. And it's only like however 5, 6 years later or something, right? So there's a lot of different ways we could go with this question. I could get very specific and technical, but I think right now I'd rather talk about the importance of the breath. Because notice that it's true, like there could be a traumatic story in someone's past, and they've already talked about it in therapy. In fact, they've talked about it for years, and they've talked about it to their friends, and they've processed it and processed it and processed it. And how come sometimes that just makes it stronger and reinforces it and reinforces it, and then sometimes it dispels it? Because it is through telling the story in a specific way that I will guide people through releasing a story once and for all, like in a few minutes. And what's the difference? And I would say, yes, there's an element to the specific language, but more importantly is the breath, and airing it out and spacing it out and breathing the breath in there and noticing where's your nervous system at when you're telling the story. And to put this into more of a Kabbalistic, to tie those things together, why is the breath so important? I mean, we could get scientific about it and talk about how when you're breathing low and slow, you're also putting yourself into parasympathetic nervous system, and your body thinks that you're safe. And now you're interfacing with an unsafe, supposedly, story while you're actually feeling safe. We could talk about the science of that, but what's interesting to me is the breath is the divine life force, right? So if we were to actually translate the ancient Hebrew word for God, there's a lot of Hebrew words for God, but the main one, which is the tetragrammaton, the 4 letters, this is a narrative for creation. And in like the Jewish tradition, it's very taboo to try and say that word. But the truth is it's not so much that it's taboo to say it, it's that it's not actually possible to pronounce the word. There's no vowels in it. It's not a sound that can be really pronounced unless the closest thing it could sound like is taking a deep breath.
Ooh, wow.
And so in that sense, what the translation that I give to that word, instead of just God, because that's, a lot of people interpret that differently, is the infinite life force that animates creation. And that's the breath. And so God and the breath are very, very closely related. The breath is the way that we are animated, the way that we get life, that we get spirit. And so we have these stories that haunt us, and they're devoid of sanctity, of reverence, of gratitude, and on the physical plane of breath. Because often the way we tell those stories is quickly and with our heart rate up and almost hyperventilating about it. And so it's interesting from the perspective of like the science and the nervous system, but it's also interesting from the perspective of like, well, yeah, we're also probably not in reverence, in awe, in gratitude to those experiences when they're still triggering us. And when we bring the breath in there, it helps us to shift, because we're bringing in God, we're bringing in divinity. And then it's one thing to know on an intellectual level, like, oh, well, surely I called this in and it formed me and da, 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 da. It doesn't matter how much you know if it hasn't been embodied into true understanding and wisdom. And that's what happens when you bring breath into it. That's what happens when you bring reverence into a situation.
Oh, that's so beautiful. I was thinking back to the 4 stages, the emanation, creation, formation, and action, and how these stories and kind of it's like a landscape. Like if you think of emanation as a landscape in which things can be grown, and how there's only partially ready to grow land, right? Because our belief system is so weeded out and so covered, right? And so it's this idea that if we just spent more time, if our systems in society gave more reverence to the beautiful space of way before the actual structure and action, just building that beautiful land and as much as possible. Because one person, it's like we feel so limited. We are truly, when we tap into these things that you were speaking of, and this is what the work you are doing is tapping that in for other people to realize the limitlessness of self, that true capacity, and that real intense epiphany of our ability to go above and beyond what we ever thought possible, and spending as much time in the emanation and cleaning up those belief systems is what we all, there's not one person who doesn't need to do that, right? There's so much beautiful work that can be done there.
Yeah, well, when you think about I'm going to emanate, you're going to emanate what's within. You're going to bring forth what's within. And so if you're a mess inside, that's what's going to emanate forth from you. And if you're in balance, that's what's going to emanate from you. And so, yeah, absolutely.
It's as above, so below, within.
Well, and what's interesting is it's like, that's why I also like the 4 worlds is an entire healing tradition, really, because it does address it at these different levels. And while the belief level is extremely important, there's other things we can do in the meantime on the physical level that's also going to help, like eating a clean diet, and so they're not exclusive either. People are like, well, should I do this modality or that modality? And it's like, well, the father of medicine teaches us lifestyle, food, medicine, emergency medicine, right? And I mean, that's my paraphrased version of it, but and so that's why, for example, and I know you deal with the herbal medicine and the teas, and so do I, as I'm a clinical Western herbalist, right? And that's also part of why I'm creating my herbal medicine company as well, is because sometimes, yes, we can bring the breath in and we can address it from the level of belief, and like, please know the importance of that step of the process because it's extremely important. And meanwhile, but definitely not instead of, but also it can be really supportive to add in some, herbal extracts that are going to support your brain function while you're rewiring those pathways, or some, herbal medicines that are going to give you energy from the place of supporting your, adrenals and your inner vitality, not from like depleting it through excess caffeine or something, to give you energy while you're going through this deep work that you do actually need to, take some extra rest time from, right? So there's these other allies, and I know you and I are both so passionate about the plant world, and I'll work with them as allies to support myself or my clients while we're doing that deep repatterning work. So that's what's so beautiful too, is like we have so many tools that can hold us.
That's so perfect. And even just thinking of what your product is, and in honor of you, I'm having rose and tulsi. I felt like that was the closest to Sheefra medicine I could get. It was like so heart opening and so just like this, it feels so expansive, but it's not quite yours, your potion that is coming. But I genuinely love, no matter what people think about plants as vegetables or as whatever that goes when it comes to plant medicine, whether it be mushroom, ayahuasca, or rose petals, there's an intelligence that is so expansive and so meant to tap into our own shields and our own systems that, we're always looking at, if we're specifically with reception or receptivity, letting the armor down. How do we let the armor down? And sometimes we don't know how to do it. So we let other things like these plants help us unfold and feel safe when we really need to, of course, feel protected and have boundary. But if the work is to receive more, it is to let down some of this armor.
Well, and if the work, if this to receive more, it's tantric in its nature, right? So it's about balance, it's about harmony. It's, the story of the creation story, which I actually haven't told yet, we can get there, is about the divine masculine and the divine feminine energies coming together to create creation on the grand scale and on the micro scales. And so if it's about this weaving and this balancing, it's like this balance of, well, when do I need to be more just giving and open, and when do I need to actually have more discernment and boundary, and how do I bring those together in harmony, and when do I need to push and persevere, and when do I need to hold up and rest. And it's that those are what the 11 energy centers are those different attributes of like, when do I need to give more, and when do I need to have more discernment, when do I need to tap into what I know, and when do I need to tap into what is my inner wisdom, and these different things that balance masculine, feminine, but that balance just the way that we are in the world to find wholeness. And some of us come in, I love this analogy of like a video game, where you could think of it as like the soul is coming in and the higher self is going, like, who do I want my player to be? Like when we used to play like Mortal Kombat or something, and you're like, do I want this character or this character? And so,
Totally.
you're over there, and we're like, you and I are like, our higher selves are like, ooh, let's play this time. And we're like, oh, cool. There's this Emily character. There's the Sheefra character. There's a few others. It's like, who do you want to be? And I'm like, I kind of want to choose the Sheefra one. She's got more of these attributes, but a little bit, I guess I'm going to have less of this, but I'm like balancing it out with having more of this. And I know if I'm going to get to the next level in the game, I'm going to have to help her develop these things over here. But that sounds like fun. Like I kind of want to practice that this round. And, it's cool because she's already gotten to level 3. So I get to start from level 3 this time, and you're like, cool, yeah, I think I'll try this Emily character. She has some of the same look. She and Sheefra are kind of similar, but she's got a little bit more of this, and we're like, okay, cool. I'll see you once we get to level 7. Okay, bye.
I love that analogy. That's beautiful. It's so true. And I'm so glad we got to level 7, Sheefra, if that's when we met.
Whatever level it is. Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, that's so good. Well, okay. Yeah. Creation story. I would love to dig into that. And then also there was something you taught me that was like, I don't know if this ties into it, but how until recently it was only Jewish men over the age of 40 that were able to share this.
Yeah, that's true. That's true. It's Jewish men over the age of 40. And part of it is that there's the written tradition and then there's the non-written tradition. And so like many things, I have different interpretations. On the one hand, it wasn't allowed for anyone but Jewish men over the age of 40 to learn these things. And on the other hand, and let's just say within the Jewish community, it was men over the age of 40. On the other hand, the women didn't need to learn from the books. And that's a known thing. And that's even part of the teaching is that the women, especially in a more traditional society, we're going to be really in the feminine, which is the embodiment. Feminine energy, because our society has totally flipped masculine and feminine on their heads, and there's so many misconceptions. So what I mean about feminine energy is embodied energy. It's the life dance. The Shekhinah is the Hebrew word for the divine feminine or the embodied the embodied existence, embodiment, and also can be interpreted even as like eros, and just the sensual essence of life. And the divine feminine is said to have come and hidden herself behind the veil of creation. And so, yeah, and so that's what I mean when I say feminine.
I love that.
Let's see. So wait, redirect me. I get
Story
lost
of
in all
creation.
the
No,
stories.
we're going
Okay.
great places,
I'm
Sheefra.
like,
This is
redirect me.
beautiful.
Which way are we going?
So yeah, the story of creation, if you would
Oh,
like to share.
yeah. Okay. Once upon a time. It's funny because time, I'm going to tell the story as if it were linear, but just know that in these levels, it's not, time isn't linear, and time and space are the same thing. And this is both happened in the past and is happening anew in each moment on many levels. So once upon a time, there was the endlessness known as the Ein Sof, the without end. And the Ein Sof, the endlessness, the infinite, thought to itself, it would be so cool if I could be in relationship to anything. I'm just lonely over here. I'd love to create a creation where I could individuate beings to relate to. I want to be in relationship. Oh, cool. Okay. And then it set off to create a universe, a world, but it couldn't, because there was nowhere to do it, because the infinite, the endlessness took up all of the space, and there was no room for anything else to exist except for itself. And so it said, well, gosh, if I'm going to create creation so I can be in relationship, I'll have to create space. So in order to create more, it first had to contract itself. And actually, in order to make itself into many and make itself bigger, it had to first make itself smaller. And so it contracted itself through a process called Tzimtzum. And then it contracted itself through the contraction, through Tzimtzum, and it created a tohu, a void. And, oh, you're muted. Okay, cool. I just saw your lips move. I was like, okay. So it created,
I really love repeating these words. I hope if you're listening, you're repeating these words.
yeah, you could, yes, repeat them. We can pause and have you repeat them. So the tohu, the void. And so it's like, wow, this is cool. Now there's a void, now there's space, but it's like, oh yeah, I'm going to create creation. Oh, but the void is completely empty. There's no fabric, there's no clay, there's no material with which to create creation. Okay, well, I guess I have to put in a little bit of energy. So then the Ein Sof, the infinite, put in a ray of light called a kav. And it emitted this kav, this ray of light, into the void, the tohu. And it was just enough light so that it could animate creation, but not so much light so that it would obliterate it. So it's this very fine dance. And so the space itself, you could say, was that masculine energy. And then the kav comes down, it sends the light down. And then when that light disperses, the divine feminine, the Shekhinah, she is those sparks of light that hides herself behind the face, the countenance of creation, which is why we go outside into the world and we look up and we see the moon and we go, and we, walk by a field of wildflowers and they're just like the lupin and the balsam and the yellow and the purple and it catches us in our breath, because is how you say God in Hebrew.
Wow. Oh my gosh, I have chills.
Bringing it
Oh,
around, right?
yes. And also what you said, this is, don't let me take you off course too much, but
Oh, we're good.
how that is available. It's like very available to those willing to receive and very disconnected from those who are not.
Mm,
Right? This like idea that she is willing to show herself to those who
yeah.
whether they are open or whether they are, it's like as a young child or growing up, there's times where people would be like, wow, look at that bird. And I'd be like, okay, that's
Mm.
cool. But didn't have that, oh, now I see a bird and I lose my mind, this idea. Like, yes, when you see people who are like, and you're like, why are you so, it's like for the people who aren't there yet, just knowing it's just about being open to her, and then she starts to show herself, and then your life will forever change.
Well, I really appreciate you bringing that up too, because people will often, something I that's really important to me that I speak about is this reconnecting to the wisdom lineages of our ancestors and to the lineage of magic and of ritual and of these practices of our own lineages. And yes, I was born into this body that has this Kabbalistic lineage that I feel a lot of ownership over. But a lot of my friends here in the West are completely disconnected from the magic lineage of their ancestors. And so this to me is a really big problem. And what I love to do is to empower people that it's your inheritance too. It's in your blood and your bones too. And so when I teach the 4 worlds, when I teach Kabbalah, I'm able to set the dogma aside and take the wisdom that I call the patterns, the elemental patterns of reverence. And the elemental patterns of reverence, I can know them and recognize them because of this lineage that I inherited. And yet I can extract these universal elemental patterns of reverence that belong to any human being. And actually in the tradition, I'll give a translation of what the word Israel means in Hebrew, because in the tradition, these teachings belong to the people of Israel. And this is misinterpreted as, oh, well, then that means the people of Israel. That means, Jewish people or people from the tribe of Judah or people that are Israeli national, which by the way, that country is very new, right? So it doesn't mean any of those things. In fact, Jacob was renamed Israel after he wrestled. He had a dream / an experience where he wrestled with an angel, and the way it's written is that he wrestled with God. And so if you can imagine, he stays up all night and he's just wrestling with God and he's struggling with God and he's fighting with God, and then finally you could say he's wrestled with these things and he comes to a place of knowing with it, and he's renamed Israel. And so Israel is anyone who yearns to know God and to know the divinity within. And so these teachings are for all of us who are seekers, who are the medicine people, or even if you don't consider yourself a medicine person, you're someone who yearns to know the truth of who you really are. That's who these teachings are for, and they belong to all of us. And I want this message to reach far and wide, that these very human things, a human being is the weaving, the looming of earth and spirit. These elemental patterns of reverence, these prayer and ritual, belong to every human being who yearns to live a life of purpose from a place of compassion and love, and know the God within themselves and know their relationship to the whole and honor it, right? So this is for all of us. And yeah, again, I got off on a tangent there.
Thank you. No, thank you. Because as someone who doesn't, it's like very Eastern European / kind of don't really know lineage. It's so true how disconnected it can feel, but then knowing that that's accessible to all of us, and not just accessible, but required. I mean, you were a homesteader for 5-6 years, right? This deep connection with land, and of course with the herbs and reverence for the cycles of life. You have that intuitively, and then you also lived it. I love how multidimensional you are. You were just so amazing. But having that deep connection is what is required for us all to be healers of this land with so much reverence to Mother Earth. There can only be creative things that come from that space of healing and changing and making this turn around, right? For where we're going currently, and knowing that that's no longer an option if we would like to continue to see the birds in the air and the bees thriving, right? This deep recognition to turn that around starts within self.
Absolutely. And yeah, the four worlds correspond to the elements of earth, air, fire, and water, not in that order, but and so, there's lots of different correlations, but even just having reverence for those things and using those in the ways that, they're the tools that we've been given in this world of Asiya, in this world of action. And all of our ancestors, so important for us to remember, all of our ancestors prayed and had ritual that used those elements. No matter which part of the world your ancestors were from, no matter which language was spoken from their tongues, they all had these practices. And what we are remembering, part of what we're remembering, is the truth of that, and reclaiming that, because then we start to step into our role as humans again to tend this beautiful planet that we've inherited. And then one thing I wanted to say, I remembered as you were speaking, was, some people will say, yeah, but I want to connect more to my lineage, or I want to connect more to my ancestors, and I don't even know how or where to begin. And so I'll tell one more story about that, which is, I remember years ago now, I was living in the mountains of North Carolina, and there was a little stream, a little tiny creek in our backyard. And every morning I would go back to this creek, and I would sit by the creek, and I would call out, I would cry out to my ancestors, and I would ask them, please come be with me. Let me feel you. I need you. And I felt nothing. And I would go out the next morning, and it was just beautiful. I remember the fall leaves, wilting and falling down into the creek and then floating away on the water, and that kind of magical in between the veil of autumn. And I would cry out and I would say, ancestors, please, help me remember. Show me your wisdom. Let me know that you're behind me. Let me know that I'm not just alone in this world, far away from the lands where you lived. Where am I? What am I doing here? Help me connect. And then nothing. But I would go every single morning, and I'd let them know I'm listening. And I was. And the more I shared that, all of a sudden, I remember I did this invocation with some people, and they came. And it was an essence that could be felt, so much so that when we were done, I was like, okay, we're done. And this is where I learned, oh, we need to close the container, because she's like, are we going to tell them to go home? She's like, it's really crowded in here. I was like, oh, great. So then you close the container, and there's specific ways to do that.
That's so good.
But the point is, and especially, and there's many more layers and specifics to this, but when we're the ones in bodies, we often give our power away, and we think that spirits and things, we have so much power being in a body and having the aspect of the voice to speak out loud. That is, we could do a whole other podcast about that. That's the hidden secret, most powerful center. That is an entire mystery school in and of itself. But in being a human being in the body, we have so much power if we're willing to claim it. And we can connect, we can ask to remember, and then keep asking even if nothing comes, because then one day you wake up, and I wake up every day, and I know I have my ancestors at my back.
Wow, Sheefra. And that prompted, I'm going to share this story to you. Thank you for being such a wonderful storyteller. This is I can't wait to talk more. We're just going to have so many good stories to share. Similar story of recently this year, especially as we start talking about Day of the Dead and Halloween and this thinning of the veil and autumn, and knowing that death is as equal to life, and having that intense experience of harvesting animal, if I am, this kind of constant Scorpio energy, as you know well.
Mhm.
And had this really beautiful calling out of just help me feel. What is it? I'm listening, I'm here. I don't want to be frustrated. I just want you to know I'm here. And as soon as that moment kind of dissipates of frustration, right? That feeling of maybe it's impatience, the humanness of me, as soon as I let that surrender, there usually is a very intense reaction with the nature around me or the elements around me. And seeing, it's like we hear people talk about this, but to have that visceral connection to the trees that I was around and the water, and realizing like, oh shit, you are within this. My ancestors are within this. It might not feel like a voice coming from the sky, which sometimes it will, but it is literally this tree that is right in front of me trying to speak through the wind. And that was just like, oh my gosh, we're surrounded, we're so held, we're so safe, they're with us always. It's just the layers of opening to it.
Yeah, well, and that's how at least the physical parts of us work too, which is the composting and the repurposing, quite literally. Yeah.
Well, okay, so you sent me some labels. When is this stuff coming out? When can I get your deck? When can I read this? I need this deck. So, I mean, I have 12, 13 Oracle decks. Nothing I have seen is like this. This is something that I cannot wait to access and have in my hands. It felt so powerful. I know it's a work in progress. It's happening. So how can people follow you on Instagram or follow or find out? And how can I get this in my hands soon?
Oh, yeah.
Or when it's right,
Thank
when it's
you.
ready.
When it's ready. No, it will be soon. Should say yes, it will be soon. And um definitely people can find me at my name, Sheefra Blume. And I'm sure the spelling of that will be in the thing.
Yes.
For now, because yes, it I would say we're in the world of formation, giving structure and form to many things that someone actually asked me the other day, he was inviting me to speak on his platform, and he said, oh, how long have you been studying this? And I was like, oh gosh, 17 years. He's like, well, that's a long time. And so it's this time right now, is a lot of things are about to be released, and I'm really excited for it. It's been a beautiful period of those, like we were talking about, gestating. And so for now, people can find me on the Instagram, and my website is always going to be Sheefra Blume. I'll always have that link to wherever, so that as I am just about, and perhaps by the time this releases, it'll be, or, depending on that timeline. But even as things change, my name is my name, right? So people can go to either of those things and then be directed to, the different parts and pieces in terms of getting these herbal elixirs and herbal extract singles for supporting on those levels, and getting the book and the deck and the story alchemy, and all of that is through the vessel that is me. So
What a gift you are,
and
Sheefra.
then from there you'll be able to get the announcements of when these things are available. And I'm so excited. I'm excited to create community around it too, and be having more of these kinds of conversations with people.
They're so needed. You're so needed. Thank you so much. I'm so thrilled. Listeners, go find Sheefra. What a gift you are.
Thank you. It's so fun. So much more we
So
could
fun.
talk about. This just barely scratched the surface.
I know. So good. But we'll do a part two. We'll do a part two about the voice. And maybe as soon as this deck is live, we will do another recap.
Yeah, or demo, or I don't know, something.
Yes. Oh, you could totally do a reading for me. I
That
would
would be
selfishly love that.
That would be so cool. Do a follow-up reading.
Okay, let's do that. It's a date. Thank you,
Awesome.
Sheefra, for being on Meathead Hippie, and listeners, we will see you next week.